this edition of the Leaders in Security video interview, an initiative of the International Security Journal. Today we are joined by Dr. Steve Albrecht, who is one of the leading experts in the United States on workplace violence prevention. His consulting and training firm specialises in threat assessments, site security surveys, and employee coaching. In 1994, Dr. Steve Albrecht wrote Ticking Bombs, one of the first business books on workplace violence. This included findings with interviews from 3 convicted murderers who were in prison. He holds a doctoral degree in business administration, an MA in security management, a BS in psychology, and a BA in English. He is board certified in human resources, security, employee coaching, and threat assessment. In 1999, Steve retired from the San Diego Police Department, where he had worked for 15 years, both as a full-time officer and later as a reserve sergeant and a domestic workplace investigator. Along his journey, he has written 23 books on business, security, firearms, and law enforcement subjects. We are honoured today to have as our guest Dr. Steve Albrecht, so please join me in welcoming him to our program.
Thank you, John.
So let's kick off this, and I want to go back to 1992, when along with John Morrison, you co-authored the foundation book covering a very much a law enforcement technical concept known as contact and cover. Would you please provide us with an overview of how this sort of evolutionary tactic sort of came about and how it's progressed since then?
Many times in law enforcement and also in security, as we all know, we are driven by events. Bad things happen, and that turns the way we do our tactical approaches to things, our security approaches. In San Diego, when I was in the police academy in 1984, we lost 2 officers who were murdered in one situation. One of the officers was a female. She was disarmed and shot by the suspect who shot the other officer who was at the situation. And then within about 5 months, 6 months after that, we had another officer who was also disarmed and shot and killed. So we lost 3 cops in San Diego in about 6 months. And we went back to an old tactical concept, which really came out of the 60s and the 70s and the protest movements back then, called contact and cover. One officer has the duty, the role, the business of the contact. He or she is the one in charge of talking to the suspect, doing searches, writing tickets, looking for evidence in the suspect's car, things like that. The second officer's primary and sole function is to protect the contact officer. So the cover officer provides simply that, cover. He or she does not get involved with the business of the discussion with the suspects or searching or talking to other suspects. And what we really tried to do back in that time, and it became a national discussion, a national tactical concept, is stay within your roles, do what is expected of you as a contact officer, as a cover officer, so that both of you survive these encounters with one or more unsecured suspects.
So ever since then, we've seen that there's a lot of new innovation. And how has this contact and cover sort of principle evolved over the years?
Well, that's kind of a good news, bad news situation. Contact and cover as a thought process, as a tactical tool, has been around since the 90s, and it sort of ebbs and flows. Sometimes people modify, in quotes, the concept, and really it's oftentimes driven by the number of radio calls that officers get and the sense of urgency they have when they are doing their work to get on to the next part of their job or get on to the next part of the contact. So they end up splitting their roles. They end up taking their eyes off of each other. They end up becoming distracted by multiple suspects, and the concept sort of falls away. So it is taught nationally in the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center academies. It's taught in every state in the United States with varying degrees of success. I think sometimes in law enforcement, we're always looking for the best next solution. Sometimes the old stuff works pretty well, and we should stick with it.
So how could or should this be modified, this approach, when we're talking about single officers working out on patrol, or even security personnel who don't have the luxury of multiple officers?
Well, if you look at single officers in law enforcement, what we have tried to do in this country is teach it as a concept across city and county agencies. So city police departments, sheriff's departments, state troopers. We teach it so that each of these agencies, when they interact in the field, when they come across each other for calls or stops, they're able to do it. In the security function as well, when we have a single officer who is a security guard, armed or unarmed, and oftentimes the concept can work just as well for unarmed security as it can for armed law enforcement or armed security. The arrival of the second security officer just has them drop into that role. So contact and cover works best when there are two people. The second one arrives and says, what I need to do is watch my partner do his or her job to the safest ability possible so that he or she doesn't get attacked or assaulted or there's an escape or we watch a suspect destroy evidence or something like that. So it is equally transferable over to the security world even though it came from the law enforcement world.
And do you find that with the advent of body cams and other sort of in-car video, that people tend to sort of assume, perhaps incorrectly, that the camera will provide the role of the cover officer?
I think that's possible. I think that's also because, you know, in the United States, we have shows like Cops on Fox TV. We have the TV program called Live PD and variations of those things where the camera sort of protects the officer there because he or she thinks, well, this person won't assault me if there's two guys with cameras standing around. This person won't run away. And I think with the body cams too, there's a sense sometimes of complacency that can happen. You say, well, this person realizes they're being recorded, and what sometimes we forget is suspects don't care about that stuff. I mean, banks still get robbed, as we know, and we can have the best security video solutions on the planet, and people will still try to steal or rob from us.
No, look, absolutely. I mean, you know, moving forward from your sort of, I guess, career on the beat, you know, where you were dealing with suspects during field stops, you know, you also co-authored one of the seminal publications on workplace violence in 1994 with the book entitled Ticking Bombs, Diffusing Violence in the Workplace. And now this book includes your notes from interviews with convicted workplace murderers, which sounds like an early version of an active shooter. How did this sort of book arise? How did you get involved in this subject? And from talking to these convicted murderers, you know, what was their response to you and what did we learn?
In the United States in the 90s, before the book came out, we were mostly seeing shootings that happened at post offices. And that was where the phrase going postal came from. Fortunately, that phrase has died as a vernacular in the United States. It's not connected to the post office as much anymore because we haven't had a postal shooting in about 20 years. But around that time, it was really kind of a post office type of a situation where these you know, the classic quote, disgruntled employee would come to work with a gun. In fact, the Postmaster General, a guy named Marvin Runyon, wrote the foreword for our book back in 94. I wrote the book with a police psychologist in San Diego because he had done the debrief for all the first responders for the worst mass shooting in the history of the United States. What happened when I was in the academy in 1984 at a McDonald's in San Diego, a perpetrator came in with guns and killed 21 people. So our first approach to this book was really about, you know, what is this sort of post office phenomenon and what do we learn looking forward to some of the other incidents. So for that book, I interviewed a man named Robert Mack, and he had shot and killed the HR manager that handled his termination and shot and paralyzed his boss, who later died, in General Dynamics in San Diego. He was a ICBM missile mechanic, and he shot and killed these two people during a termination hearing. So I went to the prison. I asked him one question: why did you do that? And we had about a 3-hour conversation. Wow. And back in those days, in the 90s, you could get into the prison and have pretty detailed conversations with these inmates. And then in subsequent years, I've talked to 2 other workplace murderers, including a guy who killed 8 people at his ex-wife's beauty salon in Seal Beach, California, and a man who killed 2 people after he had been terminated from a tech firm in San Diego. So the Ticking Bombs book was probably too early. We were pre-Columbine, and Columbine happened in 2000, and we were probably too early on the subject of workplace violence. Columbine sort of flipped a switch in the United States, not only for the school security piece and the concept of threat assessment, but also the police response to mass shooters. So the book was probably too early, even though it was, you know, one of the first ones to really open people's eyes about the concept.
So you've touched on sort of a little bit around I guess the motive, and in your book, Some People Are No Damn Good, you touched upon this a bit further about the revenge, I guess, as a driver of anger within the offender. So in our workplaces, are we paying attention to details in regard to the motive or perhaps the planning of this revenge act? And therefore, are we able to sort of identify before the event that we have a threat?
I think one of the things that we have learned, especially in the United States and overseas as well, about workplace violence and school violence and domestic violence that crosses over from home to work where the victim is an employee, is the news media really sort of drives the discussion about motive. I don't care as much about motive. I can't fix motive. Motive may be irrational religious beliefs or broken heart or you fired me. That may be the motive. Mental illness, certainly, chronic pain. There's a lot of motives for people to act out in a violent way. What we need to focus on in the security world, and we do now, is interrupting the opportunity and recognizing those warning signs that especially we see from frontline employees and other people, that students that interact with the potential perpetrator, and we call them red flags, but it's really about being concerned about this person's leakage. And this person will leak what they're going to do prior to the event. And we see this in case after case where the kid that wants to shoot the football coach does not threaten the football coach. He tells his pals at the school. The guy that wants to kill his boss does not tell the boss. There will be consequences for that behavior, getting arrested, getting fired, getting put in a mental health evaluation, but he tells people around him. So when we look at this leakage, sometimes we see employees or even supervisors or managers ignore this leakage, well, he's just kidding, or he didn't really mean that, or things like that. So I think revenge is a driving factor for a lot of these cases. You fired me, you broke my heart, you embarrassed me, you took something away that I cherish or want, or I'm so mentally ill that this is the only solution I can see. So I always tell security practitioners, pay attention to who this person is the most angry at, who this person would put on a quote target list that you think of intuitively, and really focus on interrupting that opportunity and protecting those potential targets.
So you mentioned a few times the word leakage. There are a couple of, key takeaways that organisations could be doing to try and capture a way of being advised about leakage, whether it be whistleblower hotlines or some mechanism that if someone receives the leakage, now what should a firm do, what should an organisation have in place to enable someone to report the leakage?
Well, you talked about one of the best solutions I have seen, especially in schools and in workplaces, is some kind of a hotline, a tip line. Sometimes we call them ombudsman's line, or it's a we tip type of a line where students or parents or teachers or staff at a school or employees or coworkers or bosses, even anonymously, could report what they've heard. We look at leakage and other opportunities like, for example, Facebook postings or something that the person puts on social media. That's another example of leakage. And I even use, in my threat assessment investigations, I even use the presence of gossip, where one employee talks to another one, you hear something, you go, well, that sounds unusual. Why would he say that? And we dig a little deeper and we find the root causes of some of these conversations, which start off as sort of something that kind of bothers the witness coworker that heard it. We have to have them have the courage, with a capital C, to tell the safety and security stakeholders. And then, in the best possible world, we have a created, either loosely or formally structured threat assessment team inside the organization or inside the school district to talk about what we have heard.
So you mentioned threat assessment team. Are there certain, members of the threat assessment team that are crucial for a success?
It really starts at the top. The CEO at the organization, the district superintendent at a school would be the sort of the driver for the threat assessment team process, even though they don't have necessarily the expertise, but they can pay the bills and they can order things to happen. But really, if you look at a typical organization, the security director or manager is going to be a critical part of the threat assessment team, and human resources. I oftentimes find that the best connection to people problems in the organization doesn't necessarily start with security, because we're oftentimes focused on the access control and badging and facility safety and things like that. But the human resources function, especially in the United States, 70% of human resources directors are female. They tend to have a real intuitive sense of danger, oftentimes maybe different than the security manager. They're concerned about behaviors of current employees, ex-employees, or employees that are experiencing domestic violence, which may cross over. So I think there's a real partnership there between human resources function and the security function. And then you throw in the IT manager, IT director for the cybersecurity piece. The facilities director is a critical component. That person will help us a lot in the protection of the facility. And then we look at really specific or individual expertise like a risk management and safety officers and things like that come together as a group and say, what do we collectively do about this information? And we may not have all of it, but we have enough to be able to decide on a plan.
We've covered off a lot of, I guess, the preventative types of measures we can take. Following on from this, and you know, taking into consideration, you know, your well-established research and experiences and publications, would you like to expand on some of the theories of response to an active shooter, and does this crossover actually back into preparation?
Well, in the United States, we have the protocol of run, hide, fight. This was created from the Department of Homeland Security, and there's a pretty well-seen video that's done by the City of Houston, Texas, and the Department of Homeland Security called Run, Hide, Fight. It's about 6 minutes long, and it's been seen by something like 25 million people. I like the concept a lot. I think it's the best thing we know about this issue. There are other ways to talk about, there are other acronyms and things that connected to it, but I like the simplicity of three things. The first choice is leave the building as quickly and safely as possible, taking as many people with you, co-workers, customers, clients, vendors. The second is to shelter in place, hide out, break room, restroom, conference room, supervisor's office, training room, someplace we can barricade the doors until the police arrive. And really the police response has been so fine-tuned after events like Columbine and the Las Vegas mass shooting and other shootings, where every law enforcement agency in the United States, no matter how small or large, has been trained in the active shooter response. In the Columbine, pre-Columbine days, the police would show up with a perimeter around the building and wait for the arrival of the SWAT team. We don't do that anymore. People die while they wait for the SWAT team to arrive. Now police come in and get in teams of 2 and 3 and 4, and they try to engage with this perpetrator and stop him or her. So if you look at the third step, I'm always trying to talk about in training classes that you have to have the wherewithal, the courage to fight back. These people are not Navy SEALs or Marine commandos gone rogue that are doing these shootings. These are goofballs that live in their parents' basement, that have access to guns, that have significant mental health issues, that have significant triggering events in their life, and they want to get back at somebody through this revenge piece. So I like the run, hide, fight concept. We continue to train it, and we put out videos in this country that everybody should have some knowledge of this issue. Even the rare possibility it ever happens in your facility, you should know those three things.
Knowing what to do, which sort of feeds back into being proactive and prevention, touches back onto security, because security is really all about preventing it happening, and law enforcement is often seen as the response for when it goes wrong to prevent it happening again. So how do companies need to, or what do companies need to consider when they're balancing off both the proactive and the reactive elements of active shooters?
I think the biggest challenge I face with my clients is to get them to actually do a run, hide, fight drill once a year. We do earthquake drills and tornado drills and hurricane drills, and in this country, everybody's done a fire drill at least once a year, we hope. But I have a hard time getting senior level, CEO level, C-suite level executives to understand the wisdom of at least once a year doing what I would call a 15-minute drill. For 15 minutes before we get busy with the day, we're going to replicate the run part or the hide part. We don't need to do the fight part, but we replicate evacuating. If that's what you choose to do, leave the building for 15 minutes, go someplace safe, away from the building, or hide out in some portion of the building that you have already thought about, not a designated safe room, but someplace you've already thought about. It's a broom closet, it's a training room, it's a stairwell that you can lock, and do that for 15 minutes, and then come back to work, pick up your pens, get back on the keyboard, answer the telephone, go back to work. I have a hard time getting CEOs and C-suite level people to do that because they see it as a distraction. They see it as intimidating. They see it as frightening the employees unnecessarily. I'm not saying we have to bring in guys with masks and fake guns and that type of thing, but we need to continue to ingrain into people's mindset what they do in an emergency. And you know from your experience, people do what they have been told to do under stress if they have been trained about it. If you don't know that you have to press 9 first to get an outside telephone line before you can dial 911 in the United States, you're not going to remember to do that under stress. So I just say, can we go back to a simple mindset like a fire drill that says, let us train for this at least once a year, so we can say to plaintiffs' attorneys if something happens, or we can say to risk management or safety or security people, we have at least attempted to ingrain this concept into the minds of our employees, and the rare possibility this thing would ever happen.
Bringing on to sort of, I guess, the last question here is, with and I'm very interested to get your thoughts on this one, is that with limited training budgets and personnel's time, and this not just goes for law enforcement, but for security and induction program and orientation programs for new employees. How do we balance the concepts that work versus those that are, shiny and all new and the latest thing? How do we work out this balancing act?
I think that security directors and managers and security practitioners can use the events that have happened most recently in their particular country or their in the United States, what country they're in, or they can use those types of events and saying, here's a similar situation that could happen in this typical facility, our facility or a client's facility. These are things that might happen here. Let's use the most recent incidents as a driver for the discussion, as a driver for the training piece, or as a driver for the new policy piece. So I always tell security professionals, look to what has happened and use that as the leverage point for your discussion with the senior executives, because things kind of drift out of people's minds. They go, well, that happened several years ago and that doesn't relate to us. Where you go, here's the thing that happened yesterday. Here's the thing that happened last week that's specifically connected to our industry or the types of business that we do or the type of facility that we have. I think security has to keep chipping away at sort of the idea of denial and chipping away at the idea of this won't happen here, with just a constant reassuring presence that say we have a policy in place, we have protocols in place, we have training, especially like you said, new employee orientation, new discussions. We're going to keep working this process of educating people about something which could never happen, but we're going to have a plan for it if it does.
Look, excellent. And thanks so much for your time. There's so much that you've touched upon today. So thank you to Dr. Steve Albrecht for his time today. I'm John Cowling, and thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the International Security Journal for industry updates and notifications of the future episodes in our Leaders in Security video series. Good night.